inventory, how much they can keep in generating stations, unless your numbers are in, this is a quote, unless your numbers are in single-digit days, don't bother ordering more trains. And they're talking about their inventory piles. Coal shippers continue to see the rail service melt down negatively, affecting their operations. Many power plants are faced with trying to save their stockpiles for the upcoming heavy power usage months. A lot of people don't realize that the heavy power usage months are the summer, not the winter. And especially up in the northern plains, they don't understand that. Ethanol companies, conversation with South Dakota ethanol companies show that several ethanol producers are days away from closing or already shut down due to lack of transportation of the ethanol that they produce. Most of them have no more than 10 days worth of production that they can store on site. The Canadian situation, and this does affect what's going on here. As of March 25th, Canadian railroads were 70,000 cars behind. And there were 39 vessels waiting for grain on the West Coast, 28 in Vancouver, 11 at Prince Rupert. Canadian wheat farmers had a better than expected wheat harvest. The real possibility is that the 2013-14 crop will not get moved in large quantity by the time the 2014-15 crop gets there. That's very disconcerting to the wheat farmers, and carryover estimates may run as high as 28 million tons. Shipper issues. Up in Canada, falling grain prices, widening basis, creating cash flow crunch, driving spreads apart. Storage bins are already full. Grain company issues at the same in the country are widening basis, payment of vessel demurrage on late deliveries, and paying contract extension costs and lost opportunities. Canadian wheat producers are starting to move grain now down south onto the High Line. That creates more problems on top of what we've already got. CP head Hunter Harrison confirmed what the shippers have long feared. The railroads view grain and coal as something they can move now or later. Speaking to the Wall Street audience on March 12, 2014, Harrison said bulk shipments, including grain, were modestly affected by the severe winter weather, but his railway did well moving container traffic. Quote, because that's the one commodity we're sensitive to. Quote, if you miss, you missed. It's not like grain or coal, where if you're a little bit late, you're still going to haul it away. It's still going to be there. If the intermodal train trailer comes in Friday night and you're not able to handle it, probably won't be going there on Monday. This is one of the concerns in the grain community. It's still going to be there. We're going to have some rotting problems, but the grain traffic's still going to be there. So summary. On March 21st, Pnsf was 16,000 cars behind, 23 days. The states of the greatest backlog are North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, Minnesota, areas where the BNs have the greatest market power to dominate traffic. Outlook, it's probably too early to tell, but USDA is already saying in their statement in this proceeding that a lot of the 2013-14 crop won't be moved. It will still be in the bin by the time the 2015 crop comes on board. Estimates of new PNW traffic for export coal and domestic oil may add as many as 116 million to 160 million tons of freight into the Pacific Northwest over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, to put all that in perspective, if we take all of the grain that moves into the PNW, we're talking about 40 million tons. So if they're talking somewhere in the 100, and Matt Rose has already said it's between 50 and 100 million, that they're going to be increasing there. So the growth in traffic and associated necessary rail expense will lead to continuing issues for maybe even the next decade. Shippers need to be treated fairly. This is our request. Captive and non-captive. Railroads are not like private companies. They think rather they are federally granted franchises that are greatly affected with the public interest, and railroads are required to serve all customers fairly with statutory common carrier obligation. We need the STB to issue service orders to ensure fairness in the allocation of cars and locomotive power throughout the system. We need to have transparency in this process, and above all, the shippers, and you've heard it today, need a department of straight answers at the railroads. Yes, we're talking to them. No, we're not getting anywhere. Consideration to be given opening up constricted systems to increased access by other rail carriers to provide power and cars to move the product. We respectfully request the STB keep this record open. And then I'll affirm what Tom Schick said at ACC regarding the comments about increased competition. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Peterson.
Good morning, Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Begeman. On behalf of the American Soybean Association, we appreciate the Surface Transportation Board holding this public hearing on rail service issues and providing the opportunity for us to share with you the impacts being experienced by soybean farmers. My name is Lance Peterson. I'm a soybean farmer from the western part of Minnesota in a town called Underwood. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the American Soybean Growers Association. ASA is the national trade association that represents our nation's nearly 600,000 soybean farmers on national and international policy issues. Like other crops and commodities, transportation has a large impact on the bottom line for soybean producers. Soybeans are especially impacted by transportation costs, as over 50% of U.S. soybeans are exported, and soybeans and soy products are the leading U.S. agricultural export, with an export value of over $28 billion in 2013. Soybeans provide an essential and efficient source of protein and vegetable oil that contributes significantly to feeding and nourishing the growing world's population. The tremendous increase in demand for poultry, pork, and beef, which are fed with soybean meal, is a primary reason for increased global demand for soybeans. Many in the world rely on U.S. soybean farmers to meet their protein and vegetable oil demands. U.S. farmers in turn rely on trucks, rail, and barges to move our products to those markets. A great deal of discussion has taken place in the last few months in regards to inadequate rail movement in the upper Midwest. The discussion is centered on slow shipments due to cold weather. I understand that challenge, but I'm very concerned that the warmer temperatures are not going to fix this. The real issue is the shifting of rail assets to the rapidly expanding oil industry. This is occurring at the expense of long-standing shippers who rely heavily on rail movement to conduct their business. As an agriculture producer in western Minnesota, I am faced with a direct and substantial financial impact. Inadequate rail service directly drives up the cost per rail car by thousands of dollars. Within much of agriculture, including the soybean industry, when transportation costs escalate, those costs are usually not passed on to the ultimate customer. Instead, they rest with the farmer on the local level. Currently, elevated transportation costs in my area equate to about 60 cents per bushel, above what we have traditionally been paying. And we are seeing a 40 cent per bushel additional cost at least 9 months out. This equates to real dollars. I was able to get part of my 2013 crop moved before this transportation issue largely developed. So I am looking at a loss on my 2013 crop of about $40,000 on the remaining bushels that I need to ship. Income lost on next year's crop is projected to be much larger, far in excess of $100,000. This is a loss for just one producer. When tabulated for the thousands of farm operations across the upper Midwest, the losses could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. This is making lenders hesitant, and it could make it difficult for farmers to get operating loans to finance their business. A restriction on operating loans would have a devastating impact on farmers and on the rural economy. Rail is an integral part of the competitiveness of U.S. agricultural exports. The United States has developed long-standing international marketing relationships built on delivering consistent quality and timely shipments. Grain sales are made and freight is locked in with the understanding that shuttle trains will be operating with a turnaround time of roughly 3 trips per month. Recent shuttle turnaround times have been much worse, and now a great deal of uncertainty exists in regards to future service. Will adequate shuttle capacity be available to efficiently meet demand? Major railroad investments have been talked about, but will they materialize, and will they come before tremendous loss has occurred for shippers? The impact to agriculture producers is not just on the shipping of harvested commodities to market, but also in getting inputs such as fertilizer to the farm to produce a crop in the first place. For many of us, that time is now or is rapidly approaching. The demand for rail shipments of soybeans is expected to continue to grow in the coming years, and this is supported by a farm-to-market study commissioned by the Soy Transportation Coalition and conducted by Inform Economics in July of 2012. The study shows that in key states where we already are experiencing rail service issues today, the demand will continue to rise from the soybean sector. For example, in 2009 and 10, 126 million bushels of soybeans from Minnesota were transported by rail, and that number is projected to increase to 137 million bushels in 2020 and 21. In South Dakota, it's projected to rise from 108 million in 2009 and 10 to 128 million in 2020-21. For North Dakota, it goes from 147 million bushels by rail in 2009 and 10 to 187 million bushels in 2020 and 21. The annual marketing report for the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at North Dakota State University shows that North Dakota soybean shipments have already gone over 172 million bushels for 2012 and 13. Making production projections into the future is an imprecise endeavor, but the takeaway from most forecasts is that soybean shipments will be increasing, and the rail network needs to accommodate this growth, along with the growth in crude oil shipments. We know that there has been an increase in demand and severe winter weather has contributed to service disruptions. However, ASA is urging the companies and the STB to ensure that the service provided to soybean and agricultural commodities is in balance with that provided to other sectors. For our part, to address demand over the long term, ASA will continue to carry the message to Congress and the administration in support of policies that encourage or provide direct investment in expanding transportation capacity, including rail, trucks, and waterways. This will include a tax credit applied to new rail infrastructure, funding for waterways infrastructure, and increased truck weight limits that will expand transportation capacity and increase transportation service competition. Steps to improve and expand energy infrastructure could also alleviate rail demand by providing alternative ways to accommodate the growing domestic oil and gas production. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today. We appreciate the attention the Surface Transportation Board has placed on this issue and encourage you to continue to diligently monitor this process and ensure that progress is made to optimize the efficient movement of commodities by rail.
Good morning, Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Begeman. My name is Bill Gordon. I am also a soybean farmer. I'm from Worthington, Minnesota, and I'm testifying here today on behalf of the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association. Thank you again for the Surface Transportation Board holding the public hearing on rail issues. Minnesota soybean farmers produce over 300 million bushels of soybeans per year, making us the third largest soybean producing state in the country, and accounting for over $4.2 billion in value. Many of those soybeans in Minnesota are exported to China and the Asian market and get there via truck and rail to the ports of the Pacific Northwest. Minnesota soybean farmers are largely dependent on rail service, and the transportation issues have a large impact on our bottom line. The rail service problems have been acknowledged by the rail companies and are known to the STB, and will be detailed by many impacted stakeholders testifying here today. As laid out by my colleague, American Soybean Association, inadequate rail service directly drives up the rail car costs by thousands of dollars, as reflected in the price farmers are paid locally. The cumulative financial impact for the thousands of farmers' operations in Minnesota and across the upper Midwest could potentially reach hundreds of millions of dollars. The impact extends to the ability of farmers to get operating loans, which you heard already, which many rely on upon our financing their business, and the ability to get these materials and inputs to the farms produce a crop. The demand of the rail shipments of soybeans is expected to continue to grow in Minnesota and the upper Midwestern states in the coming years. A farm-to-market study, as mentioned earlier, from Informa 2012, 126 million bushels in 2009-10 to 137 million bushels by 2020-21. The rail network needs to accommodate this growth, along with the growth of other states and other communities, commodity sectors. We know that there have been increase in demand and severe weather has contributed to service disruptions. However, the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association, along with the American Soybean Association, is urging companies and the STB to ensure the service provided to soybeans and agricultural commodities is a balance with the other sectors. For our part, to address demand over the long term, we will continue to carry a message to Minnesota senators, representatives, and to the administration in support of policies that encourage investment in expanding rail capacity. Together with our national organization, we actively advocate for investment that expands transportation capacity and improve transportation efficiency, including waterways, transportation infrastructure, and increased truck capacity and efficiency. Our competitiveness in the global market and our livelihood depend on being able to reliably deliver our products in a timely and cost-effective manner. These other modes of transportation are not within the jurisdiction of the STB, but expanding capacity for those modes may be the only way to increase transportation service and competition. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. Thank you again.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson?
Good morning. My name is Dave Andreessen. I am the CEO.
Andreessen, I apologize.
After 50 years, 60 years, I'm used to it. So
It's the
thank you.
first time it ever happened.
I'm the CEO of an agricultural producer co-op in northeast South Dakota and southeast North Dakota. I'll be pretty brief because a lot of my comments have been made. My main premise is that the rail service needs to be restored to levels of the prior years for grain, ethanol, and crop nutrients commonly called fertilizer. Our industry has been told numerous times that the rail carriers have not taken away resources and allocated them to other commodities, and that the real reason for the shortage of power is due to the extreme winter. I have lived in South Dakota for 20 years and 40 years in Minnesota, and I believe we've had extreme winters before. I would ask the committee to investigate the possibility of other carriers to be allowed to operate in our corridor until this situation is resolved. While there are several shippers who will go into more detail later, I want to give you a flavor of what is happening at the local level, at our local cooperative. Just one of our grain terminals, known as a shuttle loader, is currently 2.5 months behind on service, or 800 cars. While the lack of grain service is dire, I believe the next real crisis is coming in the next week to 10 days. The crisis I speak of is a continued lack of service of supplying the corridor with the needed crop nutrients that our patrons are going to need for the next planting season, which is right around the corner. Currently, all ours at our cooperative and other cooperatives, all our fertilizer agronomy centers are full of product. However, we turn or refill these plants multiple times during the season. This is a very small window we have to work with. We're being told by our suppliers, do not expect much until the end of May. The planting season is over for corn at the end of May. I got a phone call last night from one of our two major suppliers. Our producers and our cooperative put millions and millions and millions of dollars down to buy product last fall and last winter. As of last night, we got put on a 66% allocation of everything that we've already paid for and everything our producers have already paid for. So if rail service does not pick up in the next 7 to 10 days, our producers are only going to get 66% of what they paid for and may not get the balance. So if we're concerned about rail service on hauling more corn out this fall, we may have just fixed part of the problem because it may not get planted, plain and simple. Like I said, I'll make up for lost time here. In closing, I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to be heard and ask the committee to please understand that this is a situation that needs to be rectified now and not 6 months or a year from now. And I would also ask the committee to use any emergency measures in your power to alleviate this crisis. I thank you for your time, and I would be available for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Andreessen. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the STB for holding this hearing. My name is Roger Johnson. I'm here on behalf of the National Farmers Union. I'm the president of that organization. We appreciate very much the opportunity to express our concerns regarding recent service problems with respect to the U.S. rail network, specifically the areas in Montana, North and South Dakota, and Minnesota. Please note that I'm also providing copies of North Dakota Farmers Union's testimony at their request. In addition, Montana Farmers Union submitted written testimony. South Dakota Farmers Union is also appearing here on in a panel. And I would also like to commend the STP for holding a stakeholder meeting in North Dakota to address some of the issues earlier. We are a grassroots-driven family farm organization that represents roughly 200,000 family farmers and ranchers across the country. A large portion of our membership is located in these 4 states. These are states that are most affected by the recent CP and Pnsf rail transportation delays, as you've been hearing all day. NFU has long advocated for protection against protection of captive shippers. In fact, this is one of the issues at the core of our organization's creation more than 100 years ago. Access to rail transportation continues to be one of the most important factors in the prosperity of rural America. Many farmers often operate on very narrow margins, and when you have these kinds of enormous costs imposed on the system, it causes significant financial problems. NFU is very concerned about the service problems on the CP and BNSF systems. Our members report there's a significant lack of rail cars at their elevators, which leads to delays and additional costs the elevators then pass on to farmers. The delays, we are told, are caused by two factors: unusually cold weather and a low priority for agricultural goods in the face of significantly increased rail traffic specifically related to coal and oil. The former reason is understandable. Winters get cold. But it's also transitory, and it'll fix itself. The latter reason is a much longer-term problem that this board needs to address. As is stated in Montana and North Dakota Farmers Union's testimonies, unfortunately, agriculture does not seem to be a priority for either of these two railroads. It seems that oil, coal, and container shipments are ahead of grain in the list of shipping priorities. Oil production in the Bakken Formation of Montana and North Dakota has led to a tremendous boom in production. Compared to this time last year, the Bakken is producing around 1.1 million barrels of oil per day, up from 800,000 1 year ago and up from 200,000 in 2009. It's a phenomenal increase. Incidentally, in 2009, I was still the Ag Commissioner in North Dakota, and one of my responsibilities was regulating the oil and gas industry. Most of the oil at that point in time was shipped through pipelines. That capacity is full, so now it's largely moved to the railroads. Similarly, there has been a significant increase in coal exports from the Powder River Basin to the PNW. Western Organization of Resource Councils recently released a study, Heavy Traffic Still Ahead. I'll provide copies for the record for the board, just released a month and a half ago, which shows that coal exports to the PNW have more than doubled just since 2012, and these increased volumes in coal and oil shipments have displaced grain shippers, leading to long, expensive delays. Because there are fewer cars and ag commodities are not prioritized, there are long delays in grain shipments. Our members in North Dakota and South Dakota report delays of 17 to 40 days. Montana Farmers Union reports delays of around 28 days. These delays are very costly because end users impose stiff penalties for late shipments. As is referenced in North Dakota Farmers Union's testimony, when delays exceed 5 days, penalties of 5 to 10 cents a bushel apply per day. Grain elevators contract with these end users and ultimately have to widen the basis in order to cover the cost of these penalties, thus decreasing the cash price and passing these increased costs onto the farmers in the form of lower prices for the commodity being shipped. For wheat, that cost is around 40 cents to $1 a bushel, which includes the penalty and the additional basis cost. Using just the lower number, this translates to a loss of about $10,000 per average farm just for wheat in North Dakota. The situation is simply unacceptable. Commodity groups such as wheat have spent a lot of time and money building relationships with customers. As you heard earlier, the wheat in this area of the country, the majority of it is exported. It has to go over the rail to hit those export markets. Because U.S. wheat has been seen as being delivered reliably and as a high-quality product, it's often paid a premium for timeliness of delivery. With these ongoing delays, the relationships with end customers are at serious risk. I encourage the STB to address the problems of captive shippers. In particular, I urge the board to hold railroads responsible for losses due to delayed delivery of rail cars. BNSF and CP need to guarantee that a certain portion of shipments will be dedicated to agricultural products. BNSF and CP need to ensure that there is increased investment going forward to account for the significant increase in demand. Finally, As I know you are well aware, this area of the country has for many years faced non-competitive rail rates due to the consolidation in the rail industry and the resulting lack of effective transportation competition. The recent oil and coal production increases have now placed further obstacles to fair, competitive rail rate treatment on agriculture and is a long-term problem that needs to be addressed. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Chairman Elliott and Vice Chairman Begeman. My name is Kevin Thompson, and I'm an Assistant Vice President and the Transportation Leader for the grain and oilseed businesses of Cargill Incorporated in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I appear today on behalf of the National Grain and Feed Association, where I serve as the Chairman of the Rail Shipper Receiver Committee, and I also wish to note that this statement is supported by the National Oilseed Processors Association, the North American Millers Association, and other industry organizations. The NGFA consists of more than 1,000 grain, feed, processing, and grain-related companies that operate approximately 7,000 facilities that handle about 70% of all U.S. grains and oilseeds. The NGFA commends the board for conducting this public hearing and appreciates the opportunity to speak on behalf of its shippers and receivers of grain, oilseeds, grain products concerning the serious rail service disruptions that's plagued our industry since last fall. The NGFA would first like to provide several real-world examples of the impact in terms of market impacts and costs that rail service disruptions have had on our member companies and producer customers we serve. Second, we want to share some observations resulting from the ongoing dialogue the NGFA has been having with several affected Class 1 rail carriers. I'll conclude with several specific recommendations on the types of actions we believe the board can and should take to improve the relevance, timeliness, and transparency of service-related metrics and information that would be useful to rail customers to assist in planning logistics during what we anticipate will be a long, slow restoration of service, particularly in the western United States. Rail service disruptions, which began well before the onset of harsh winter weather, have been widespread and severe. In the west, shippers served by the Pnsf Railway and the Canadian Pacific have been particularly hard hit, especially in areas like North and South Dakota, Montana, and parts of Minnesota, where there are few, if any, viable alternatives to rail moving grain products, or fertilizer. Meanwhile, in the east, NGFA member companies served by the Norfolk Southern and CSX have reported service disruptions as well. In the case of the NS, members have also expressed concerns over the lack of adequate, consistent, and timely information that could have been used to make adjustments in logistics where possible. The NGFA's strong preference is to have individual rail customers resolve service-related issues directly through one-on-one discussions with their respective carriers in a commercial business setting. But since early January, when the impacts began being felt industry-wide, the NGFA has taken on a greater role in addressing service-related issues directly with the rail carriers on behalf of its member companies. The sheer gravity, magnitude, and scope of rail service disruptions now being experienced are unprecedented and have rippled through all sectors of grain-based agriculture. As a result, country elevators and other originators of grain and grain products are extremely hesitant to price and book forward sales from farmers or commercial elevators because they cannot count on predictable rail service or reflect the current level of freight cost in their bids. Grain processors and export elevators have idled or significantly reduced operating capacity because of an inability to predictably source sufficient quantities of grains and oilseeds. Millers in the upper and central Midwest are facing facility shutdowns because they're running out of raw commodities, including oats and certain classes of wheat. Still, other grain processing and animal feeding operations, particularly in the eastern United States, are shifting to comparatively inefficient and much more costly long-haul truck movements in an attempt to obtain sufficient quantities of grain and oilseeds. Still others are switching rail origination to other carriers in the limited instances where that's possible. And for the first time in a long time, the United States has earned the United States' hard-earned reputation as the world's most reliable supplier of grains and oilseeds and grain products to export markets has been put at risk. Specific examples of economic harm caused by rail service disruptions have been provided to NGFA by member companies in response to our request. In the West, the Canadian Pacific has been 60 days late or later in providing 100-car unit trains and up to 4 months late on non-shuttles. Meanwhile, the Pnsf only now has started to provide Certificate of Transportation, known as COTS, trains that shippers have paid to have delivered in January and February. The NGFA has also received repeated reports of locomotives being de-linked from trains and cars sitting loaded but idled at grain facilities for over weeks on end. In the East, there have been sharply reduced turn times on unit trains for both domestic and export service, increasing car costs, reducing capacity, and causing repeated functional shutdowns of feed mills dependent upon rail deliveries. Likewise, single car shipments of ingredients for both feed in both the East and West have been delayed. Freight delays have caused grain, feed, and grain processing firms to alter commitments to farmers and commercial customers alike. Grain and feed ingredient contracts have been renegotiated and repriced, often at a significant penalty, as they were underfilled or rolled forward to future delivery dates because they cannot be executed with the contractual time of commitment. Another fallout is illustrated by the values paid in the secondary rail car freight market, where the majority of secondary rail freight has traded at values of approximately $4,000 per car, which equates to $1 per bushel. One NGFA member company provided the following actual case involving a unit train shipment of soybeans from North Dakota to the Pacific Northwest in March, in which the tariff rate was approximately $5,000 per car, and the expense to secure the necessary rail freight from the secondary market amounted to another $4,000 per car. After adding the fuel surcharge, the actual cost translated to $2.60 a bushel, which transportation alone represented 40% of that total cost. For a time, our industry absorbed most of these additional expenses, but since early March, such escalating costs attributable to service disruptions have been reflected in lower price bids to farmers in several regions of the country. Our written statement includes charts that illustrate the precipitous decline in grain price bids offered to farmers in Montana and North and South Dakota. Additional costs have also been incurred by those shippers and receivers that operate privately owned hopper car fleets. One NGFA member company in the eastern United States reported that the number of turns it got in its private car fleet declined to such an extent since March that it effectively increased its fleet cost and decreased its carrying capacity by 60%. Cost impacts on individual grain, feed, grain processing, and export facilities obviously vary. But several NGFA member companies have reported that the costs to their individual firms have ranged from $10 million to $20 million during the October to March period. Over the past 15 years, the U.S. grain handling, processing, and export industry and producer customers have made extensive private capital investments, including greatly expanding grain handling and loading capacity, private car fleets, and additional track capacity to further enhance efficiency. Some of that investment was made at the behest of rail carriers seeking improved economies of scale. But despite these investments, our industry has found itself unable to serve customers efficiently or reliably during the most recent harvest season because of the precipitous decline and unpredictability in service from several Class I carriers. Even during periods not characterized by the type of severe service disruptions being experienced currently, ag rail users often find that when rail capacity is in tight supply, rail service appears to suffer more for our sector than any other sectors that may be viewed as higher priority by railroads such as coal, energy, and intermodal. This raises a core question we believe the board needs to assess carefully. Namely, to what extent do Class I carriers in the highly concentrated rail market have a common carrier obligation to provide reasonable service on reasonable requests? At what point is a railroad's decision to skew its allocation of resources and service towards certain products that maximize its profits inconsistent with a statutory common carrier obligation to rail users? What are the carrier's obligations to balance their business desire for greater volumes and greater profitability with the traditional statutory obligation to provide reasonable service across all customer segments? Concerning current service disruptions, the The NGFA and its member companies have been in active discussions with several affected rail carriers on the causes as well as each carrier's recovery plans for restoring service. There clearly were root causes not attributable to weather, such as misreading the volume of business that would be generated by agriculture, coal, energy, and other sectors, inadequate locomotive power and crews, and operations-related issues, such as the continuation of maintenance-away projects during the peak harvest period. The NGFA has encouraged each affected carrier to provide more information on when measurable improvements in rail service realistically can be expected, and to ramp up their ongoing communications with customers to provide timely and frequent information in if their service commitments cannot be attained. This information is critical for our industry to be able to adjust business plans and attempt to minimize the economic harm to operations and revenues and to serve customers. We're pleased, in particular, that the BNSF has responded with increased ongoing communications with our association and its member companies, as well as agriculture producers and other customers. We believe this positive dialogue with the BNS will continue. However, the NGFA believes the current situation warrants increased monitoring and collection of data on service metrics by the board. We believe the board should require affected Class 1 rail carriers to report and subsequently should make publicly available to rail customers the following types of specific service-related metrics. This information would assist rail users in making logistical plans and enhance the board's ability to monitor service. Examples are real-time information on train velocity and cycle times, as well as realistic projections restoring service. Next, weekly car loadings by product and state, weekly average dwell times for trains hauling grain products, coal, and crude that date from January 2012 and onward. Weekly averages for miles per day transited for grain, coal, crude since January 2012 and onward. The level of capacity utilization by rail corridors, particularly in the heavy grain corridors of the Pacific Northwest and Texas Gulf. For example, if a Class 1 carrier's capacity is 40 trains per day within the Pacific Northwest corridor, what percentage of that capacity is currently being utilized and what is a product mix? Real-time data on the number of grain and oilseed, coal and crude oil sets transported by quarter starting in January of 2012 and ongoing. Next, breakout of capital spending by Class 1 carriers. The NGFA commends rail carriers for investing in their infrastructure, but we believe it would be advisable for carriers to report the share of capital spending being directed to new infrastructure capacity, such as new track, versus just replacement of existing infrastructure. The NGFA also recommends that the STB require carriers to report on a quarterly basis net crew and locomotive changes so rail users can better assess these barometers of potential service improvement. In addition, the NGFA recommends that the board obtain and make available publicly the following information for each Class 1 carrier. First, what plans, if any, do each of the Class 1 carriers now experiencing service disruptions have to make on additional business before current service issues are resolved? Second, what plans do Class 1 carriers have for reducing operations-related service disruptions that occurred last fall, including maintenance-away restrictions? Specifically, we believe the board should require Class 1 carriers to provide rail customers with advanced information on the precise location and duration of specific service disruptions caused by infrastructure projects. Finally, we believe that during this period of service disruption, the board should require affected Class 1 rail carriers to provide consistent web-based communications and e-blasts to all their rail customers on the status of their service and train orders. Some Class 1 railroads are doing a commendable job in such communication with their customers, the BNSF and CSX in particular, but others clearly are not, more so relying on word of mouth or calls to specific customers, but not all. Rail users need more consistency in communication across the board. At this stage, the NGFA does not believe it is advisable for the board to take actions in the United States similar to those implemented by the Canadian government. We fear such measures would likely further exacerbate and slow the recovery and the restoration in U.S. rail service. Thus, we are not at this time asking the board for direct service orders that would create preferences for agricultural shipments. But the NGFA is asking the board to exercise very vigilant oversight during this period of service disruption to prevent rail carriers from allocating limited available capacity to serve new business from non-agriculture sectors such as coal, energy, to the detriment of ag customers. We also believe the current rail environment points to the importance of the board's proceeding on competitive switching rules under Ex parte number 711. The rail service disruptions experienced by ag shippers are tangible examples of why captive rail shippers and receivers need enhanced access to the lines of other carriers wherever possible to keep facilities open and operating and market served. The NGFA also believes strongly that these rail service disruptions point to the urgency of the United States adopting a comprehensive, all-the-above transportation infrastructure policy that supports all modes, including inland waterways, harbors and ports, and trucks. We need all transportation modes if we're going to move this nation. The NGFA appreciates the opportunity to express its views and recommendations during this critically important public hearing, and I would be pleased to respond to any questions the board may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you all very much. Very, very useful information. If I could start with Mr. Lynch, and thank you for reading the governor's letter. Oh, you can't hear me? Sorry about that. You had mentioned about 3 or 4 elevators have 4,000 delayed cars, another 11,000 total, so that's a lot of cars.
Yes.
Is it this the amount just that you are aware of, or is that pretty much canvassed the state?
Vice Chair Begeman, that's what we are aware of at this point. Some of that's anecdotal, some of that's the conversations that we're having. By no means is that all inclusive from our understanding, and I would just take this moment. It is as much what's in inventory that needs to be shipped as much as getting ready for the 2014 planning season. That backlog of cars is very significant and very concerning. I think Dave Andreessen's point needs to be underscored, the fact that we are right on the front end of a very, very critical need, and that's our nutrients and our fertilizer.
Could you provide some insight on the breakdown of the backlog, if you will, and the future concern between, let's say, CP versus BN, since it's basically the only service available? Is it primarily on one carrier? Is it equally divided in terms of the problem? And any of you are welcome to comment.
Sure, and I would probably lead off with just saying I think it's a systematic situation that we're dealing with. It's pretty clear that across our rail infrastructure in our state, there's a need there to be a collaborative and a forward-looking solution. The main line, of course, being a BN line, the CP line, as we are looking at our state lines as well, trying to do everything we can to make sure that we're supporting free-flowing trains and rails in our state. But I would defer to others on the panel for additional details.
Great. And if I could ask Mr. Andreessen and Mr. Hancock, you mentioned, well, I'll start with you. You mentioned that you've been told no cars going east to Chicago. Could you elaborate a bit on what you were told and what option would you have?
Vice Chairman Begeman, the other option would be to deliver that wheat to the Texas Gulf, which is not a viable marketing option.
How do you get it there?
Rail.
I realize that, but if you...
But it could go on the CP or it could go on the BN either
So the
way.
same carriers.
Same
it's just
carriers.
they will take you
it
to a different
doesn't
place.
help our situation at all. It's just a way of deferring the problem or moving the problem from wheat to corn is what I feel like. They're trying to catch up on the West Coast backlog that they have right now, and so they're trying to use the cars that they normally would have going over Chicago and east. They're moving those into the corn and bean areas.
But I'm hearing you correctly that really, although in a way it may sound good, it really isn't an option that works for you.
No, I wouldn't have brought it up. It absolutely does not work for us.
And is because there's not a market?
Correct. There's not a competitive market that wouldn't utilize the same rail carriers.
And in terms of the future crop year and I guess fertilizer, et cetera, does that come in tank cars?
It comes in hopper.
It comes in hopper.
Dry plant food comes in hopper cars, and then we also get UAN solutions in tanker cars.
Mr. Whiteside, could you comment a bit further, for my benefit at least, on, you mentioned the 48 car, I don't know if you call it the marriage rule, and I think what you said was that that Burlington Northern implemented it last August. Is that, did I hear you correctly?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you tell me the extent to which, and I realize it may be your opinion, but how that has that had a real true impact on the situation we're talking about here, or is it just another frustration and thing that, or is it causing your shippers who have 48 to 55 cars or unable to move because they can't find their competitor to join with?
Well, I think the 4855s, which are the non-shuttles, are suffering from two problems. One is the marriage car rule, and number two is no cars. So, I don't know that the marriage car rule has had the impact yet, simply because they aren't having the cars. But the governor, or at least the Department of Agriculture director, is very engaged in this process of trying to figure out a solution in the state, and we're working with the Burlington Northern trying to find another solution rather than implement this thing fully. But maybe the effect hasn't been felt quite as much as it would be if there were lots of cars available.
Mr. Peterson, you mentioned your personal loss for the year, which for me is extraordinary, and your a potential loss for next year, which I couldn't even imagine myself. But do you have insurance? Does crop insurance cover that type of loss, or do you just have insurance for during production?
Yes, Vice Chairman Begeman, crop insurance would not play a role in this at all.
You just have to...
Oh, yeah, this is a risk that popped up that was most certainly not anticipated. So we've got many different types of risks that we need to bear, and this is one that certainly it fluctuates from time to time, especially if a very large crop comes and it needs to be moved. But this one, okay, we addressed the fact that we had major winter concerns, but why are we looking at this problem having such a long tail into next year? Are we already predicting weather concerns for next year too? I think it's the opposite. I think there's so much uncertainty in the marketplace that the railroad's going to actually be able to deliver that then it's driving up the cost of those cars again, because they're saying, we don't think we're going to get the cars. So some of the shippers are saying, well, I'm going to have to pay this nasty price now because I've got to have cars. And all of a sudden, there we've got $2,000 to $3,000 car premiums built right in because there's so much concern over the ability to move the freight and move the crops, move the goods.
Mr. Andreessen, and this will be my last question, but you said that you got a call last night about only being allocated 66% of the product that you've already paid for. A call from who? I mean, is it a carrier issue, or is this a provider issue?
It's a provider. It's one of our major wholesale providers. There's only so many people in the United States or Canada that you have as a major supplier. And we deal with two major suppliers, so we don't have everything in one bucket. And this supplier said, you are on allocation of 66% until we can get more freight. And like I stated before, this is millions of dollars that we have paid for and the producers have paid for. So now at our level, we have to go to our producers starting this morning with a phone call of who do we allocate this to?
So that's basically a shipper problem for the folks that you bought it from.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chairman, I think there, though, what you're talking about, if I might, is that the reason that the supplier is saying 66% is because they can't get the cars to move there. So it's still a railroad problem.
I understand
Just reversed.
that. I understand that, yes.
Back to some of the questions that I asked earlier. One of my biggest concerns here is communications, and so I'm hearing somewhat mixed reviews on that. On this panel, is anybody here running into a brick wall as far as communications are concerned with one of the carriers, or are they seemingly discussing your situations with you as much as I guess can be possible?
There's definite open lines of communication, but as a previous panel member had said, the communication goes back and forth, but there is no results.
Okay.
So it's not like they're not talking to us, but
Right. Is that pretty much across the board, that you are getting people to pick up the phone, it's just the results don't appear to be there?
Yeah, if I could add, communications are much better, and they have been since we really got into the heart of these problems. I guess the one thing I would like to point out is the communications were after the fact. Okay, the communication started once the problems really became widespread and started hurting the industry. We weren't communicated as the other product lines were continuing to have increased demand, which ultimately affected a lot of the other product lines. So, although and that's why is very important, as we say, to go forward to get real-time information and communication from all the Class 1 carriers.
Okay. As far as the communication, this is more of a statement than a question, but I do want to encourage those of you who do have problems to use our Rail Customer and Public Assistance Program if possible. I know Mr. Whiteside mentioned, retaliation, issues from his viewpoint, and I just want to assure you that would not be tolerated by the board, and that would be something we would take very seriously. But I do want to encourage you to use that process, because we have had results, and especially if there is grain rotting or things that are, especially of an emergency nature, they have been able to at least get some service there to eliminate those problems. So I do encourage you to use that. Mr. Hancock, back to Vice Chairman Begeman's question regarding service through Chicago. Is that specific to both of the railroads, BNSF and CP, or is that just one of the railroads that isn't taking it through Chicago?
Mr. Chairman, the only announcement we got was from the CP. We have not heard that from the BN.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that for my own information. Also, I've heard some discussion and hearing about some of these issues, that some of the grain cars are either defective or require repair by you while you're on the run, basically. Has that been a problem for some of you?
I can answer that, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
And I'm actually going to answer this, I hope this is okay, on behalf of the South Dakota Grain and Feed Association, because we just did a member survey, and we addressed this issue. And there was a range from 3 to 15% of the unit trains were being rejected as bad orders. So it is an issue. And I can attest to the same thing in our locations. Probably somewhere between 3 to 8% of our cars are rejected as bad orders.
And is that on both carriers, BNSF and CP?
It's probably better on the BN. The CP's freight cars are older cars for the most part. And on the BN, it's all we get are shuttles. We don't get anything smaller than that. So the shuttle cars are usually in good condition.
Okay. Anyone else on that?
Not on that.
Let's see. As far as also, Mr. Hancock, you mentioned earlier about. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. That's what you get for coming in late. You mentioned some penalties that some of the elevators are suffering. I think you mentioned $150,000, which sounds like a significant number. When you have these communications with the railroads, are there any discussions about how those penalties with respect to your service and service issues come into play? I mean, do they work with you on that, or is it just a matter of you take the hit?
Mr. Chairman, to an extent, they will work with you. A lot of these penalties, though, are the cars do not meet contract time periods and are delivered late, and they have to be bought in by our buyer from another shipper that has that same train or that same commodity loaded already, and so they impose a penalty on us based on what they had to pay for that commodity at that moment in time. If you understand what I'm trying to get at there.
Sure. Yep. All right, thank you. That's helpful. Anyone else? Mr. Gordon?
Kind of an unseen penalty is our export markets for like China. China basically imports like 70% of our soybeans. We have these delayed shipments. If there's not enough product in the Pacific Northwest to fulfill a shipment, China will go to South America and buy beans. So not only do you not have the shipment, the beans are still sitting in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, you lost the entire Panamax ship of soybeans to the South American market because they needed the beans yesterday, not 3 or 4 months from now.
I see.
And if I could add on that issue, along with that loss is the reputation. And the likelihood that next year or the year after, you're just a notch lower in terms of reliability. It's a really, really big deal.
I understand. As far as grain car availability, do you see that as probably the most significant problem that you're facing at the present time, that there just aren't enough grain cars out there for you, or is it more of a cycle time issue?
I can, Chairman.
Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, I don't think it's so much car availability as it is what it feels like from our members' statements. It's more of a power and crew issue. We've had multiple examples where we have shuttle trains, which are supposed to be a very efficient method of transportation with high velocity, high cycle times. We've seen many instances where they sit loaded at destination for anywhere from 5 to 15 days because they have to take power away from that train and take it and allocate it somewhere else.
Okay. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Mr. Whiteside?
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to make sure that the record's clarified, too. The folks that we've been talking with in the conference calls with your staffs and the offices have indicated they're very concerned about retaliation, but there's not been any open retaliation going on. It's a matter of, based on past experiences, they're very concerned. So that's why they're not opening up. Just make sure that's clear on the record.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. That is important.
Can I just interrupt first? I am curious, though, how typical is it for you to come to Washington with a problem? I mean, I don't think you have time for that normally.
Fortunately, I was going to be out here anyhow to do some lobbying, but I was informed just yesterday that I needed to take somebody's place. But so glad to be here.
Madam Chairman, Mr. Chairman, we decided 3 days ago that 8 of us from Minnesota were coming out. We had plane issues, so only 6 of us made it. 3 are on Capitol Hill right now lobbying on this behalf. The other 3 of us, one from North Dakota, is in the room, and we fly out in 3 hours to go home to start working our planners so we can keep going.
And in no way am I dismissing what you told us, Mr. Whiteside. I am very sensitive to that. I just, from where I come from, you don't just want to come to Washington and, well, actually, maybe you do. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Well, I just have one more, I guess, a comment, and the smart people might want to get a hook and pull me off this dais, so that'll be fun to watch. But you know, there is a transaction pending dealing with the state of South Dakota and with CP, and I know if that would go forward, and there's a short time frame at least, it would appear at this point, but no transaction I've seen really is seamless, and so I hope that folks will really work together if it does get approved to try to make it as seamless as possible, because additional chaos is not something I don't think anyone can afford, whether it's the carrier or the state or your shippers. So there are a lot of people in this room. I hope they're exchanging cards, that you're introducing each other, because I do agree with what Dan's theme has been throughout this. This is like communication here really is critical, and the more that we can facilitate that, we would like to do.
Mr. Whiteside?
Mr. Chairman, Vice President Begman, it's really important for you all to understand that the growers need the railroads probably more than the railroads need them. And this is very important to the economy. This fertilizer issue that's coming up in the next 2 or 3 weeks, luckily in Montana it occurs a little bit later, but it's only 3 weeks away up there. If that fertilizer doesn't get there, that crop will not be planted. If that crop doesn't get planted, then these effects go on for another whole year. And there's no concrete evidence right now that fertilizers will be there. So we need action soon to see if that immediate problem can be solved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whiteside. I'd just also like to thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I know this was short notice, and your testimony has been very informative and very helpful. It's sometimes difficult for us to get, a real feel for what's going on where you are, and you've, I think, really related that to us very well, and we greatly appreciate it, and we wish you better luck on your flights back home. Thank you.
Morning. How are you? Good to see you. Nice to see you.
Great. Now we'll hear from panel number 4, BNSF Railway and Canadian Pacific. You can begin.
Good morning. I'm Steve Bobb, Executive Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer for BNSF. Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, we welcome the opportunity to review the factors contributing to service issues our customers are currently experiencing. We have been in weekly dialogue with the staff of the board and regularly provide service metrics to help the board better understand both the drivers of these problems and what we are doing to improve the current situation. We are very aware that BNSF's service has not met our customers' expectations or our own high standards. Let me say at the outset of my comments to you that we will do everything that can be done to restore service levels. You have our commitment. And to our customers who are present here and the many others who are not here today, let me say we know that we have created supply chain risk for you and fell short in providing a level of service that you expect from BNSF. I'd like to review a few slides. It is important to view our current service issues in context so as to better understand how we got here and what is required to once again reach service performance levels acceptable to our customers. You can be sure we are doing all that we can and expending every resource necessary to restore our network, and will do so in a transparent and accountable manner. To explain how we got here, BNSF volumes have continued to grow year over year since the depth of the recession in 2009. As you will see on slides 3 and 4, BNSF has been growing significantly faster than the rest of the industry. In fact, BNSF moved over 400,000 units of the 800,000 unit growth on the U.S. rail system in 2013, over 50% of the total. You will see in slide 5 that the epicenter of significant The epicenter of significant BNSF growth is in North Dakota. You should know that during first quarter, North Dakota grain products has grown 18% over first quarter of 2009, and North Dakota grain shipments have grown 41% since first quarter of 2009 during this first quarter of 2014. This volume all by itself represents 20% of the rail industry's growth in 2013. The growth continues, as noted on slide 6. Compared to 2009, BNSF handled more traffic in 2012 and 2013. So far in 2014, even with our current difficulties, our volumes are higher yet. During the first quarter of 2014 versus 13, South Dakota grain shipments were up 48%, and grain product shipments were up 14%. Volumes on our railroad are near our all-time high of 2006, with a fundamental difference. The growth we have experienced is on different parts of our road than the traffic of 2006. Specifically, this concentration is on the Northern Transcon. The automatic assumption is that all this growth has been crude, but that is not the case. We have seen growth across many sectors of our railroad, with our largest volume increases coming from the domestic intermodal shipments. Twice this year, we have moved over 200,000 units in a week. This hasn't happened in the first quarter since 2007. The assumption that all volume growth is crude is also linked to the persistent belief that service for crude shipments is given preference over other commodities on the railroad. The reality is that crude volumes have seen a velocity reduction as well. Regardless of commodity, if a customer is experiencing a severe service issue, we escalate the situation and focus resources to avoid a facility or plant from having to temporarily halt operation. This process is the same for all shippers and for all commodities, including grain, crude, and coal. Looking to the long term, as we have continued to do what we've always done and continue to do, we're going to invest in resources to accommodate growth. The last 4 years are our largest capital programs ever. This year and 2013 are each of the largest ever in the freight rail industry. We have processes for short and long-term planning, and we have forecasts that are continually adjusted throughout the year. Every year we have a plan to flex up or down as needed. What is problematic is that demand in 2012 and 13 exceeded what markets and our customers forecasted. This has resulted in being consistently and constantly flexed up for a sustained and extended period of time as we continue to add capacity. Unfortunately, the flex wasn't enough. The strain on our network was magnified last October when ag volumes spiked in a very short period of time, jumping about 40 shuttle sets in a 2-week period. At the same time as crude spreads widened and the additional facilities came online, crude volume ramped up as well. Coal sets had also been steadily increasing since midsummer. Network velocity was declining during this period late last year, leading into one of the hardest winters we've experienced in decades. The sustained cold and record levels of snow had a severe impact on an already strained system. The Chicago complex in particular, which you'll hear more about today, became an incredible impediment to velocity and serving our customers. We implemented numerous countermeasures and added significant resources such as people and locomotives during this time to keep freight moving. We have worked hard to be open, transparent, and forthright with all of our customers during this challenging time. We have worked on an individual basis with our customers to provide the most up-to-date information and maintain two-way communication to ensure we take care of their most critical needs. Some of those customers are here today. With weather finally getting warmer and summer maybe around the corner, we remain focused on working on our way through this situation and improving service. There are signs of improvement which are reflected in the current volume numbers. We also continue with our long-term efforts to add capacity and grow as our customers grow. Capacity is added 4 ways: people, power, equipment, and physical plant. BNSF is investing heavily in all 4, and much of that investment will be in the north where this growth is occurring. We will work our way through the current issues and come out of it a stronger railroad. The capacity being added will benefit all of our customers going forward. Not all improvements are awaiting infrastructure investment. For example, we will have current ag demand moved and be positioned for new crop this fall. My colleague, Bob Least, Vice President, Service Design and Performance, will now walk us through this in more detail, along with our expectations going forward in our 3 primary regions. I will then review the efforts we have taken with our customers during this time, and then we will be ready to answer any questions you might have. Bob?
Thanks, Steve. Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Bigeman, good morning. Steve provided you an overview of growth, volume, and some of our challenges. I'll offer some further details. And to do so, I'll review a handful of slides so as to better frame the testimony we're providing. So on the first chart, too quick on the button, on the first chart you'll see is an overview of our ag volumes, and this compares all ag shipments that moved in the 4th quarter of 2013 last year versus our peak year in 2006. Customer shipment activity, you can see, is very concentrated on our north region. The largest increases are in loaded shipments, primarily moving from these north origins to Pacific Northwest export facilities. On the next page is a view of our network that depicts industrial products, which includes crude by rail, and shows the volume surge we experienced also in the 4th quarter of last year, concentrated towards Chicago, but also increases in traffic towards the PNW. This traffic, along with ag shipments, concentrated on our north region. You will likely hear, and you have so far from some of our coal customers today, regarding delivery cycles and coal stockpiles. We do put a lot of resources into supporting coal, and the substantial run-up of coal that occurred last year in both train sets and associated locomotives from the 2nd quarter to the 3rd quarters, we responded to increased demand with coal with an increase of 30% in cars and locomotives, increasing those sets dedicated to the movement of coal from 340 sets to 445 sets. Drawing your attention to this slide, which does depict a lot of information, but really is a key element of timing of various activities. As I just shared with you, through the 2nd and 3rd quarter, volume in our large commodity sectors was quite strong. Then came October, which is where the lines converge towards the right side of this chart. That's October of last year. Spreads in the crude oil market began to widen, driving up instant demand for more crude by rail capacity. Added to that, a record grain harvest in a very compressed time period was underway. We flexed resources from across our entire network from all lines of business to support this surge in traffic, all of which occurred on our northern region. And then velocity began to slow, which resulted in a pattern that incrementally required more locomotives, more train crews, and more track capacity. This slide really does sum up the situation we faced in the 4th quarter. Grain surged, coal jumped, crude oil spiked, and velocity slowed down. Earlier, Steve outlined the 4 critical requirements of railroad capacity: locomotives, rolling stock, train crews, and track capacity. Looking here specifically at locomotives, we continue to add them in historic record numbers, growing our resources in response to our customers growing their business. Same can be said of our train crews. We are adding train crews at a pace that exceeds our planned volume. This is a view of how we think about and how we plan for capacity across our network. The traffic forecast that we have drives our review of potential bottlenecks to be solved. In terms of critical resources, adding track capacity takes the longest time, in particular on our north region where the construction season is 7 months long. This slide looks at one key subdivision on our north region, the Glasgow sub, where we're investing close to $400 million to double the train capacity on just this one subdivision in 4 years. Talking about winter, which has been repeated multiple times, a recurring theme through the day-to-day. As we worked through our traffic surge from the 4th quarter, we were behind in terms of velocity, behind in locomotives and crews. Then a really, really tough winter took hold, and the outcomes got worse. We operated shorter trains due to the temperatures. We had to redeploy manpower from across our network to support the northern Transcon as well as operations in Chicago. The resulting congestion in and around Chicago brought about by winter conditions had a ripple effect on all three of our key corridors as trains were held and staged to manage the flow in and out of Chicago. This began a period through February and March where interchange traffic was shifted away from Chicago to alternate gateways of St. Louis and Memphis. So, of course, we did extend the transit time for shipments for many customers whose traffic routed through Chicago. Many of our ag customers, ethanol, sugar producers, crude producers, and coal utilities, as well as others, experienced longer transit times as cars were moved on these alternate routes. We operate a winter railroad on BNSF. We know how to execute across the northern plains. We've been doing it for a long time. But this winter was very harsh. This winter was very harsh, and the numbers reflected on this slide do show that. Going too fast. Given the surge in traffic, a tough winter, and declining velocity, we took additional short-term actions. Aggressively increased our hiring program for train crews with emphasis on our north region, brought on additional locomotives and added supervisors, and strengthened our customer service processes to better ensure that severe service issues were captured and escalated as we continued an all-hands-on-deck approach to recovering our network and network capabilities. No railroad had spent $4 billion in capital until we did it last year in 2013, followed by a $5 billion capital program this year. That's an average of greater than $4 billion a year over the last 4 years. We are significantly reinvesting in our railroad for growth and our customers' growth. You can see the allocation of this year's CapEx program. We knew the short-term actions were not enough. We are taking steps to strengthen our commitment to growing our railroad alongside our customers. Our hiring plan now has been increased to 5,000 new employees this year. We're purchasing over 500 locomotives, adding to the increase in our road fleet from last year, as well as acquiring additional rolling stock. Continued emphasis in adding train capacity with significant investments in additional sidings, double track, as well as terminals. Looking again at the map of our network, it shows the targeted capacity investments across our northern Transcon, which are reflected by the stars that are concentrated across the top of the map. I'm not getting a response. There we go. I'm certain everyone would like to understand our outlook for the balance of 2014 and beyond. To do that, I'll offer an assessment of our three operating regions. This shows our South region. The South region is our premium expedited intermodal corridor with connections to the Texas Gulf area. As we enter the second quarter and work through the final effects of winter associated with the Chicago complex, the outlook is very strong for this segment of our railroad to execute the operating plan that's been similar to past levels of performance. Key indicators of dwell and velocity both bear that out, with reductions in dwell and improvements in train speed. The Central Corridor, the second of our large three regions, represents the majority of our heavy haul coal route and includes the Powder River Basin area, as well as many of our utility customers and destination facilities. While this corridor does not connect with Chicago through most of February and March, there was considerable congestion as traffic flows for manifest trains as well as many unit trains were shifted away from Chicago to gateway junctions on this corridor. Heavy haul requires heavy maintenance, most of which is still ahead of us in 2014. Maintenance windows will slow train velocity, but we know how to do both, how to run trains and how to work on track. On balance, this quarter should see similar year-over-year performance. Terminal dwell is improving on this region. Velocity is slightly degraded, although all the alternate gateway traffic is now shifted back to Chicago, and we should see train speed start to stabilize. Coal tons, again representative on this region. Looking at the tons of coal delivered, we're recovering from a really bad winter, and you can see that in the bar reflecting February. The coal tons delivered in March is our sixth biggest month in the last 27 months. we continue to handle a lot of coal. Tons delivered is largely a product of velocity and equipment sets. As velocity degraded, more sets were added. As velocity begins to rebound, less sets are needed to deliver the same tons. There certainly is a clear-cut lag in what our customers see and experience, but on balance, our coal train business is improving. Our North region. Train crews, locomotives, and rolling stock will be onboarded to catch up with the growth on this quarter. At the same time, the majority of our expansion capital will be spent on the northern route. This track capacity will not come on as rapidly as the other critical resources. We fully anticipate 2014 will not return to the same level of train velocity that has been the norm in the past or was experienced in the first and second quarter of 2013. Although terminal switching, local train service, including connections in and out of Chicago, will be restored to previous levels of performance, run times across the corridor will be longer, while the variability will be reduced until the majority of the capital projects are completed. Each new capacity investment piece will incrementally improve performance as it comes online. North performance compared to our baseline from the peak of winter conditions, both train speed and terminal dwell have improved. We have a long tradition of handling unit grain shipments across the upper Midwest to the export facilities in the Pacific Northwest, as we've heard this morning. Delivery of loaded units did not meet all customer demand, but compared to previous harvest periods, we have moved substantial volumes. We fully intend to be nearly current with past due grain orders by the start of this year's harvest. Of course, the board has heard about Amtrak performance issue, as well as Administrator Szabo's comments. Trains have been late and variability has been high. Winter conditions and surges in train volumes have impacted all trains on our North region, as well as the Empire Builder and Amtrak number 7 and 8. As we move into April, the overall lateness has been reduced and the variability of performance has been compressed. Nonetheless, we've clearly not met or performed up to our commitments to Amtrak or their passengers. We have crafted a new schedule, as was mentioned, with Amtrak on our northern route that takes effect next week. This new schedule will more closely reflect post-winter track conditions and slow orders, as well as the increased volume of trains on the corridor. Steve.
I'd like to make a few comments about customer contact during this period and then wrap up. During our operating challenges, we have increased our customer contact significantly, and I will offer just one example. Our industrial products team might routinely have about 100 business reviews with customers per quarter. During the first quarter, that team had scheduled weekly meetings or phone calls with a focus on service numbering about 100 per week. In addition to those scheduled interactions, over 500 industrial products customer meetings or conference calls with a focus on service took place during first quarter. A similar increased tempo of customer communication took place across all 4 business units. We will continue a high transparency approach to customer communications as we work to add capacity throughout 2014. We understand that we have shared a lot of information in a short amount of time on a subject with many complexities that merit serious discussion. We also recognize that while we have experienced remarkable growth and handled tremendous volumes, we have disappointed many of our customers in our handling of that growth. I have no doubt that as we continue to analyze our approach and our actions for handling this increased volume, we will find in our plan reviews that some of the root causes of the current congestion could have been prevented with a better understanding of the growth that had occurred and is continuing to occur, and better asset planning could have occurred as a result. At the same time, I know that other factors like the weather were simply out of our control. We've heard comments, and I expect to hear more comments from our customers today that will detail specific experiences where we failed to meet their expectations and or were unable to execute a needed service recovery. I will be here throughout the day to make sure I hear their issues and able to review what's happening and what we're doing about it. I also note that submitted comments suggest various segments wanting their freight moved in front of or instead of other freight. Freight rail is a network business. We will build out capacity with the goal to accommodate all of this demand. We understand that is our responsibility. I will add that the practical ability for directed service to move more volume is unlikely given that the primary constraint is track capacity. We will continue our efforts to restore velocity and service levels on our network, and we hope that you appreciate the level of energy and financial investment that we have focused on improving the situation as quickly as possible. We are confident that we are gaining momentum, seeing the improvements, and that much more are on the way. As we move forward, we're also committing that same level of energy to communicate with our customers on the status of their individual situations, along with the improvements on the network. You will hear from several of our customers again today that are here, and I would expect that they will tell you we are not doing enough and we are not meeting their demand. We understand that velocity-caused equipment shortages and or variability in our operation are forcing rail traffic to truck, impacting plant operations, and impacting operations of our customer's customer. At the same time, it's important to remember that we are a very busy railroad handling lots of volume. As we restore network velocity, we will be in a position to handle customer demand. I promise you that all of us at BNSF understand the importance and the urgency of improving their service. We also understand the importance of communicating with our customers frequently and with transparency. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bob and Mr. Leese, and I do greatly appreciate your commitments to work towards a solution. Mr. Creel?
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Bigman. I'm pleased to be here this morning to have an opportunity to discuss the status of rail service this year and to provide context on the challenges we at CP have been experiencing, to reinforce that these conditions are temporary. Full service will be restored in the weeks ahead, and to confirm that providing quality service is how we work and how we differentiate ourselves. We're very aware of the impact that this reduced network velocity has had on our customers and to their businesses. I can assure you of our commitment to turn the situation around as quickly as possible, and we'll do it as safely as possible. As this is done, we'll continue to communicate directly with our customers regarding our progress. I'd also like to stress that I will continually be involved in the steps required to return the U.S. network to above normal service levels. But before I go any further, I think it's important that we address two pervasive myths regarding our service. First, CP is not steering resources to Canada at the expense of U.S. Secondly, crude volumes are 6% of our U.S. traffic base. These are not displacing grain volumes, which represent 22% of that base, or other commodities for that matter. In fact, in the case of grain, it moves in large part different lanes than crude does. Today, I'll plan to focus my remarks on two important areas, service and capacity on the railway. I'll review two major variables and their impact on our performance over the last several months. From CP's perspective, the single largest challenge to the railroad supply chain in the U.S. is congestion in the Chicago Gateway. The railway supply chain, both in Canada and the U.S., has had to deal with extraordinary, extreme weather. Yes, winter does happen every year. We prepare extensively for it. But from this past December to February, railroads and all modes of transportation were severely impacted by the extraordinary cold and severe weather. To quote some facts, according to the National Weather Service, between the months of December and February, 67.4 inches of snow were recorded in Chicago, making it the third snowiest winter on record. It was the third coldest winter on record. Based on the previous 119 years of data, the National Climatic Data Center released their analysis of the past winter recently as well. They ranked the period from December through February as the 25th coldest on record in North Dakota. Minnesota was even colder, ranking 6th on record. These conditions delivered significant operational headwinds, to say the least. Sustained frigid temperatures become a tipping point in the railway industry. As you know, extreme temperatures require us to reduce our train lengths to ensure we keep our air brakes functioning safely and properly. Train length reductions of 50% are not uncommon. This greatly affects train velocity, yard dwell, and service as a direct result of this reduced capacity. The second critical point, emphasis added in CP's perspective, is our dependency upon the fluidity of the greater Chicago terminal. Roughly 40% of all CP U.S. traffic touches Chicago. All carriers operating within the defined limits of the Chicago terminal are dependent on the terminal and its intermediate carriers and the bilateral relationships between railroads. CP's operational performance, particularly in the United States, is tied directly to the fluidity of the terminal. After several months of congestion, this continues to be our major challenge. These conditions prompted the Chicago Transportation Coordination Office to escalate the terminal alert levels rapidly. In fact, conditions drove from alert level 1 straight to an alert level 3 over a period of 1 week in early January. In fact, over 2 days in January. This alert level 3 remained in effect until approximately 3 weeks ago. The alert levels and the conditions are relevant as they trigger a requirement for all of us to alter train design to block manifest shipments arriving and departing Chicago. This decreases our overall network capacity by increasing the volume of switching activity and online car dwell incurred at various locations across the system. Such measures are in place to assist Chicago's fluidity. Train staging and online switching activities are workload components that often get missed in our direct measurement of system or terminal fluidity. This combined with unit train volumes which get routed via Chicago and a high frequency of daily commuter trains handlings consumes needed capacity in the Chicago terminal. The situation in Chicago will improve dramatically when the Belt Railway Company is able to become and remain fluid. They're experiencing congestion as a result of extremely high volumes. They're dependent upon traffic being moved on time by all carriers consistently. If not, as a result, their departure yards will fill up, classification capacity decreases, which in turn results in creation of tow tracks and re-humps, or effectively double-handling cars. The net result is sustained delays in meeting demand and the traffic moving towards or through the Chicago terminal, especially in a case like CP where we're so dependent upon this terminal. We've acted to alleviate congestion in Chicago by holding trains as far back as Minneapolis. We're asking all carriers to bring and not hold any CP traffic, and we're moving some westbound trains over Chicago for switching at St. Paul and blocking eastbound traffic as far back as Canada, as well as adding additional resources and crews. The complexities of the service issues which surround the relative fluidity of our Chicago terminal have become a North American problem. It requires every carrier to commit to appropriate solutions. It requires leadership and commitment with an equivalent sense of urgency directed at decreasing capacity through the skip gateway. I'm confident we will get the Chicago terminal reset to normal operating levels. It's important to understand, emphasis added again, that not one single railway alone will improve and solve Chicago service. The challenge is to create conditions and measures in the short term which will provide the right level of step function improvement in the terminal. As you would expect, all commodity groups have been affected by these difficult operating conditions. Service metrics and CP's car loadings as a result have fallen 8.7% versus last year. In an effort to address some of the more specific questions, let me share some information relative to how CP is performing, but most importantly, what we're doing to normalize operations across the system. Since early February, we've been working with the shippers across the lines of business to find alternative routings and ship around the Chicago terminal. This has been challenging for our customers, but such action is effective and necessary in seeking the appropriate routing relief. We need to be taking action which promotes efficiency, improvement in service for Chicago, and transit time for our customers. These choices may not always mean the shortest route, but under these conditions, that should not be the deciding factor. I'll give you a very powerful example. Take two energy customers that CP serves as an example under current conditions. We encouraged both to route around Chicago. One quickly chose an alternate longer mileage route. The other declined. They followed the normal routing agreement. The results speak for themselves, and they were dramatic. The decision to implement an alternate route saved the additional dwell time experienced over the period and enabled one shipper to achieve nearly comparable year-over-year volumes. This is better for the shipper, better for the railroads, and better for Chicago. That was not the case with the alternate shipper. Let me take for a moment to expand on the significance of routing agreements. The way I see it, it's pretty simple. We need industry agreement on dynamic routing protocols that can be implemented quickly and effectively. This means we respond to extraordinary and escalating conditions with immediate plans to leverage to find alternate gateways. We need to have these in place proactively and be positioned to reallocate resources promptly. And I've got a slide here I want to show, moving to some grain comments. Let's see if I can. Anybody have any idea where it would be? How about CP? There we go. Okay, now to the grain crop year. The grain shipping season in August took off with a slower than average start. As you can see, billings, or shipments, came in below normal levels due to a later harvest. We see the typical fall peak arrive between the months of September and November. CP grain shipments came in at 2,100 plus cars a week, with weeks in excess of 2,400 cars handled. The 3-year average is 2,200. During this period, we kept pace with demand and the flow of new customer orders. The challenge began in mid-December when new orders outpaced average demand levels, meaning that just prior to severe weather and Chicago terminal congestion, we headed into the Q1 2014 environment with a climbing order deck. With over 30% of all U.S. grain routing through Chicago, performance issues became inevitable given the environment outline. However, while our eastbound grade performance in comparison came in below normal levels, more fluid operating conditions in the Pacific Northwest Gateway, which is effectively North Dakota and South Dakota origins going to Canada, across Canada, and back to western U.S. ports, we were actually able to move volumes comparable to last year. Arguably, had the overall operating conditions been more favorable, we would have maintained momentum in service and been positioned to deliver a very reasonable percentage of last year's volumes. However, this isn't the case, as we know, and it's one of the reasons I'm here. Through the month of April, as the Chicago terminal improves, We will regain our 2013 momentum across all corridors. Based on sustained demand, this would translate to exceeding 2,200 cars a week through the end of the crop year. Performance at that level would exceed the 3-year average by about 600 CP cars per week, or 33%. We'll need customer support to make this happen and to validate that all new orders take into account what is also outstanding. I understand that some have called for more cars and locomotives. To add more cars and locomotives to a system that is congested and impacted by weather is the wrong thing to do. This would be like adding more vehicles to an increasingly congested highway during rush hour and hoping the traffic would move faster. Simply not going to happen. To put power in context, for those that may think we don't have enough power in our U.S. operations, during the month of March this year, our U.S. locomotive counts matched 2013. We're acutely aware of increased cycle time impacts and the resulting constraint on car supply across industries. We have and will continue to manage resources when and where it makes sense. Other actions we've taken include ensure that we have the appropriate power plan to run maximum train lengths. This is ensuring that power is fed into the appropriate areas in a balanced fashion. We're building destination blocks to assist key locations to ensure efficiency delivery and improve cycle times. With respect to hiring and crew resources, there's no doubt that service levels have put a strain on our workforce. This has not stalled plans to hire and train both conductors and engineers. Classes are scheduled across the property are ongoing, and will bring in excess of 200 new hires in 2014. I can tell you that in my 2 decades of railroading experience, these North American railroading conditions have challenged our operating employees in ways I've never seen before. In face of such operating conditions, I'm proud of our railroaders who continue to work tirelessly 24/7 to move this volume and improve service. As I've stated, we'll get back to performance levels matching last fall and better. To achieve these results across our U.S. network will require matched effort from absolutely every service provider. With all that said, I hope it's clear we are not interested in finger-pointing. Rather, we seek to maintain a constructive dialogue on how we all create additional capacity inside and outside of Chicago. These efforts for normalized terminal throughput and service in the weeks ahead. We'll continue to keep communication channels open with our customers. In the near term, customers can also assist. Additional capacity is achieved when rail cars are unloaded once available 7 days a week, 24 hours per day by all customers across all roads. We need everyone to be thinking velocity to create the needed car capacity. To unlock capacity, normalize service, we'll need to seek the most appropriate approach in the near term and to create the right efficiencies across every road and terminal. This will directly benefit Chicago and improve rail service across the board. In closing, doing nothing ensures getting the same outcomes the next time these conditions exist. It isn't enough that we just do things differently. We simply need to do different things. I can't speak for the other roads, but you've got CP's commitment to do exactly this. CP and its employees are committed to turning things around safely and as quickly as possible. Together with our valued customers and partners, we'll get it done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Creel. A few quick questions to start, and just as far as some of the commitments are made, I think I'm hearing from both of the railroads that are up here today that you are committed to work with your customers as much as possible during during the service problems to reach, I guess, mutually workable solutions. Is that basically what I'm hearing from Pnsf and CP?
We have during these circumstances worked with our customers to adjust priorities, to deal with tactical, sometimes car by car, sometimes train by train circumstances, as well as we are committed to the longer term things that we talked about relative to building out our network to handle all of this demand.
So that includes, in addition to working with your customers, committing to getting the proper resources where they need to be in order to make this problem go away. Is that correct?
We are committed to putting the resources in place to move the volume on this railroad, yes.
Thank you. CP?
CP's absolutely committed to working with the customers. But as such for CP, it's important to state this is not a resource issue at CP. This is a velocity issue. This is a corridor capacity issue. So it's not that our track doesn't have the capacity to handle it. It's not that the car fleets. The issue is CP's connected to Chicago in a huge way. And if our customers direct traffic to Chicago, and if these bridge carriers that we have to operate with become congested due to very real extreme winter conditions, these things will occur. As soon as Chicago corrects itself and fixes itself, our capacity concerns go away. Now, we'll continue as we have to work with customers in the meantime to try to mitigate the impact of Chicago. And as I've stated, some have and some haven't. Those that have seen the benefit of it. Those that haven't, we still continue to work with them. It's it's hard to do something with something you can't get around. As of yesterday, certain bridge carrier in Chicago, when we're holding 15 trains trying to get into the terminal, adding 15 more is not going to do a lot to help it. You have to do dramatic things, which we're prepared to do, and we have done, and will continue to do.
And with respect to, I've heard quite a bit as far as hiring and adding power from BNSF, and I heard you mention that you're looking to hire about 200 new train and engine people on the railroad. Is that additional 200 over and above the number that you have right now, or are you just filling in positions as a trite?
CB's perspective, it's more attrition, and there's a small increment for additional business. We don't have the same opportunity that BN has with that kind of growth. I wish that I did, but we don't. So that's pretty much where we're at with CP.
Okay, so that, I mean, based on that, would it be fair to say that CP, in addition to, I guess, cars and power, that this isn't really a manpower issue as much as a congestion issue?
Yeah, I'm not going to suggest there's not sometimes you run out of power. If you start continually recrewing trains or run out of crews, continually recrewing trains, you're going to run out of people. But by and large, it's not a people issue at all. It's a velocity issue. It's the car issues, and it's the car cycles that get slowed down. And when you can't get cars to destination unloaded and turned back as an empty, you can't fulfill grain requests or orders for those cars that are needed. That's the primary issue at CP.
Okay. One question I had, I thought I heard earlier from BNSF that you felt that you would be able to meet the grain shippers that you would be ready for the next crop. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Okay. I think that would be an assurance that I think a lot of people in the crowd would enjoy hearing. Is there something special that we're going to be doing? I've heard some quotes in the press that the North is going to be slowed down, which I think you did say in your charts. Do you think you can do that even with the capacity issues that you've had over the last several months?
I would say very similar to CP or Keith's comments. It's about velocity. And for us right now, as we continue to recover velocity, in particular with grain shipments, we're seeing reduction in past due orders that progressively decline as we get more current on those past due orders. And as we pick up more velocity, both Chicago as well as across our network, that generates its own capacity. Higher velocity means less locomotive demand, less crew demand, less car demand, and that actually creates capacity. So the velocity that we need to support the next harvest really is the net result of running a faster railroad. That's the capacity investments that we'll incrementally leverage as they come online, and speeding up the general throughput post-winter.
I heard earlier, and I don't know whose customer this is, but Mr. Andreessen mentioned that he's up against it with respect to nutrients for the future crop. And situations like that where you're 7 or 10 days out of not having what you're needing as far as customers are concerned on both the railroads, are you working with those individuals to make sure that they get what they need if I guess in his situation, he's not going to be able to get his crop in, or in the situation of the coal shippers that we're talking, that they're just going to run out of coal and have to shut down plants as well as the chemicals?
But let me address both fertilizer and coal question, and then Bob, if you want to fill in some details. But from the standpoint of fertilizer, we're aware that we have a very large demand to move fertilizer on our railroad. We've been in communication with our fertilizer customers about that, and we know that this is going to be a real challenge. In terms of facility by facility, where we're at on a 7 or 10 day window, I couldn't tell you specifically that here this morning, but we are taking points to make sure that the empties and loads in that service are capturing every opportunity to move that we can.
Okay.
Relative to coal, we work with our customers on an ongoing basis to understand where they're at on their stockpiles, and make sure that we have the conveyor belt tuned, both the number of sets as well as the delivery rate, to stabilize stockpiles. And we've been doing this all through last fall as velocity declined on the railroad. And as winter compounded that, we continued working with customers. And in many instances, we have stabilized stockpile situations. We're not 100% there yet, and it's something we continue to work on week by week.
I guess in line with that, as far as I was asking earlier, some of the shippers with respect to is there any chance or ability to work with other Class 1 carriers if they're in a situation where they don't have as much congestion and there is capacity on their lines. The coal comes more to mind than grain, obviously. But do you see any of those opportunities while you're in this situation? I remember when you had the flooding, and BNSF did an excellent job of pulling out of the flooding and threw a lot of resources at it. But at the same time, I know there was some cooperation with the other railroads. Do you see any opportunity for that here as you go forward?
We are in discussion with a number of utilities about opportunities for them to move coal adverse to our existing contracts.
Okay. I appreciate greatly hearing that, and if there is anything we can do to help along that, I did mention in my opening earlier that we will act as quickly as possible if that needs to be. Anything with respect to CP?
No issues with coal at CP, unfortunately.
Okay. One last question. Turn it over to Ann, so I don't hog the microphone. A lot of the shippers were expressing some concerns about the amount of information that they're receiving, and I know that's not the top priority that you have right now. The top priority is making the system work. But would you also commit to providing the information, and I think you have done this fairly well with respect to the board, but to the public and to the shippers, in order that they can see that things are changing and improving as we go forward?
We believe that we have increased our communication quite dramatically, and we would be very comfortable opening the information that we're giving to the board and putting it on our website for all of our customers to see.
I appreciate that.
We'd have no objection to doing the same.
Great. I appreciate your commitments that you have made, and I appreciate you coming here today. And Vice Chairman?
Thank you. I apologize if any of my questions are redundant. You had a lot of my questions. You read my paper, teasing you. But first of all, thank you. I guess I'd like to start, if I could, sort of putting the talking points down. From what you've heard this morning, what is your reaction? How can you comment on what you have heard personally, to give a clear message to your shippers as far as what they can expect? I think, Steve, I had a little concern when you said we'll be ready by next fall. I realize that's good news. I also realize it's a long time between now and then, and that means the folks that need that fertilizer are really potentially in serious risk. So I just would like you to comment on what you've heard, both of you, of course.
Well, certainly as I listened to the associations this morning, and we'll hear from customers here later in the day, we heard many of the things that I reflected in my comments. We understand that we have put risk into our customers' supply chains. We understand that we have impacted their operations, and we understand we've impacted our customer's customer. And so we understand those impacts are out there. We have, throughout the course of this, when we've learned of plant issues that involve a rail car or a train, that if it's not delivered within a time frame, it will impact operations. We have focused on that specific movement and done everything we could to make it happen. Unfortunately, it didn't always happen, and sometimes that was weather, sometimes it was a compounding of influences, but it's not for not knowing, and it's not for not trying. We always focus on and hear about the ones that didn't work, but there have been a number of occurrences over the course of the last 2 quarters where our employees have made dramatic things happen to serve our customers. But given the amount of customer communication that we've been doing, I would have to tell you that what I heard so far this morning is not surprising to have heard it.
Vice Chairman, I would say that similar comments, very empathetic with our customers' concerns. Obviously, not moving their business is not in their best interest, and it's not in our best interest trying to run a railway business. Our car loads are down, our revenues are down as a result, our costs are up. This winter, as much as, I guess the common thing, people say and they think winter happens every year, and it's cold in Minot. Well, I've been working in Canada for the last more than a decade, and it's colder up there than it is in Minot. But I've never seen the type of severity, the prolonged severity across both continents that spans West Coast, East Coast, down into the Chicago corridor, which happen to be all effectively where all this tonnage is, to have this kind of impact on train lengths and snow, and it just never came so long, so much at the same time in such a condensed fashion. And I'm not going to suggest it's the new normal. I think it's a very abnormal situation. I think that we're adequately resourced. I think that in time specific to the grain, we've historically at CP done a good job of moving grain from our U.S. destinations. I'd argue the same for the Canadian, although that perception might not be there right now. But nevertheless, I'm confident as our fluidity restores, and we're starting to see progress as well. The past several weeks, we're back up to our historical levels as far as car spots. We just got a big hole to dig out of. But we're committed to do that. I'm seized with that. Our team is seized with that. And rest assured, some of the comments that I've heard that Hunter may have made and that are taken out of context, to me, that is not Hunter Harrison's focus, nor is it my focus day in and day out. We understand how important grain is. All of our customers' freight's important, but some of the rhetoric that's out there, the stuff about crude, crude is important. I value my crude shippers, but if you know the facts of the business and the economics, I make more money hauling grain than I do hauling crude. So it's not a fact that we don't care about grain at CP. That's not the case. And we'll just have to work hard to restore our credibility, to restore our customers' faith by moving the product and do it in a timely and an efficient manner. And I'm confident we have the talent and the ability and the resources to do that at CP.
I think, if I can, Vice Chairman, I would add the following comment. I don't know that we do an effective enough job of telling our story that we're a network business, that we run an outdoor assembly line. So when a customer comments about a loaded grain shuttle sitting for a week that's been loaded with soybeans in South Dakota and why it hasn't moved and the power's been removed, they don't have the transparency to recognize in running a network we have a clogged pipeline. We're holding trains short of destination going to the Pacific Northwest. We do nothing to help the movement if we advance it out of the origin. I think sometimes those elements of running a network are not obvious to the customers. I think in that line, following up on Steve's comments, where we can perhaps leverage communications a little bit more is perhaps around the elements of running a network business.
Mr. Rao, I was happy to hear your response to the chairman's question that you are in discussions with your competitors to
Let me be clear. We are not.
Potentially. I'm sorry. I thought
we are not talking to our competitors. We are talking to our customers.
I thought it was just in response to certain areas of where another carrier could come in that isn't currently.
We are talking to our customers about exercising that option.
Only to your customers.
We are not talking to our competitors.
Well, could you then? I was curious when Mr. Khan mentioned that he'd talked about this the possibility of doing this since, I guess, March 7th or 11th. He said he had not heard anything back officially. Is he going to hear back from you?
Yes, he will.
Soon?
Yes.
Well, the more that you could talk with your customers, if there are areas that trackage rights would work, I want to join with what the chairman said. We certainly encourage you to do so if it can help unclog the network in a quicker period of time or unclog the shipper's backlog. I guess what I'd like to know is what, from your perspective, can the board do to be helpful?
Okay, I will. I'll start. First, I'd like to talk about what I think the board shouldn't do, and I mentioned it in my comments, but engaging in a directed nature to focus prioritization to a specific piece of traffic or a specific piece of geography at the detriment of others, we think would be very harmful, not only to the network, but to our customers overall. The rail network is a network business, and we are focused on moving all the volume. And so focusing on part of the volume, we don't believe is a solution. Turning to what the board can do, we believe that the things that you have done relative to monitoring our metrics, encouraging us to make those metrics public, encouraging dialogue like this forum, and holding us accountable to our commitments are all the things that we think would be helpful.
The only thing I would add to that, Vice Chairman, is to encourage the customers to continue to work closely with the railways as well. There's discussions both ways where the railways don't want to work with us. Sometimes, as in my case, when you're dealing with a particular customer that you're bending over backwards to try to help them solve their supply chain problems, and they refuse to alter a gateway to fix the issue. It's tough, and it creates a situation where that customer may be putting you into crisis mode, making special moves, expending resources to avoid shutdowns, which has a ripple effect to other customers that may be working with us. So from that perspective, I would encourage the board, when customers call expressing concerns, just to ask the simple question, are you doing all you can do to work with the partnership with the railways to try to mitigate the pain as well?
And just so the record is clear, I was not suggesting any kind of antitrust issues or encouraging it. Thank you. Mr. Creel, you've talked at length about Chicago. You talked about it when we met over a month ago about that really, in your perspective, being a primary cause of your service problems at the moment. You've been at CP for a little over a year, I think. Have your resources, feeder facilities, et cetera, going into the Chicago area, have they been altered during your time? Have any facilities closed or downsized, or is it sort of standard operating procedure in terms of crew, locomotives, power?
Well, since I've joined the company, we've actually increased capacity in the corridor going to Chicago, specifically in St. Paul. We've invested just last year about $15 million. We're in the process of a Phase 2 and a Phase 3 in St. Paul to do additional blocking for Chicago to take cars, instead of sending them to the belt or instead of sending them to a bridge carrier, to go direct hit to railways. So it's increased, it hasn't decreased. In Chicago overall, I'm cautiously optimistic. The weather's better, but there's such a backlog that's been created by this winter as these railroads sort of flush out, for the lack of a better term. These bridge carriers only have so much capacity, so we have to do dramatic things to help them out individually. So yesterday, I mentioned the number of trains that we were holding for a particular bridge carrier. We did some dramatic things, and we switched some trains, and we've worked with our colleagues in the industry. I could commend all the roads. They're all working very hard. It's not for a lack of effort or resources. It's just, again, there's only so much capacity and so much you can do so quickly, but it is getting better. But we all have to stay seized with that same commitment to make sure we push it until it gets to the point that it's reset itself.
I believe it was Mr. Hancock on the previous panel had mentioned the directive that he was aware of recently from your railroad about not taking orders going east. Although he mentioned a willingness, there was a willingness by your part to redirect to the south.
Yeah, I'm glad you allowed me an opportunity to clarify that. Effectively, what's happened over the past couple of weeks since we last met, you mentioned this pending transaction that the STB has to review. We're anticipating and hoping for a favorable outcome. We've worked with that railway to source additional cars at our expense prior to the transaction, to bring those cars online with an objective to apply those to call orders to orders that are open, that are old, that are outstanding, that avoid Chicago. Now, we're not telling our customers that they can't ship to Chicago. That's inaccurate. In fact, we filled on average 400 orders to Chicago over the past several weeks. I went back and checked it after he made the comment, versus a historical average of about 600. So we're not meeting all the demand. And we are trying to discourage avoiding Chicago because I do not want to get these additional assets, the 15th to the 16th to the 17th train in line, and effectively end up with all of your fleet under load, and our orders would go even down further, which would adversely impact the customers even more. So there's a fine balance we're trying to manage. I regret that the perception of the association is we're taking no orders. That's not the case. We're just not filling all orders, and we are discouraging orders going through that market.
And maybe this is a question for both of you, but